everyone. Welcome back to Tidbits Art History. My name is Kristina Koopman, and as always, thank you for joining me. Thanks also for your patience last time around. I didn't have a video quite prepared for you, but I'm happy to be back with another video for you today, so let's get started. We as human beings love to categorize and label things. I'm sure if you go back far enough, there's some kind of evolutionary reason for this, for our need to separate and compare things, like that berry is edible or that stick isn't, etc. The tendency to define and categorize is still a very active one today. Sometimes it even presents itself by grouping things together based on what they are not. This is especially common when the item or idea is hard to understand or completely new to you. For example, I don't know what this is, but I know it's not blank. This is especially relevant for artists who were involved in the Dada movement, created specifically in reaction to World War I, who wanted to push past these barriers and categories created by the art world over the previous centuries. In a quote by art historian Jesse Bryant Wilder, he explains the Dada movement as, quote, a revolt against everything that seemed to have paved the way to the war. The Dadaists were young and perhaps naively believed they could change the world by mocking it, end quote. According to Hans Richter, one of the original founding members of the Dada movement, the movement was designed to be misunderstood. Quote, Dada invited, or rather defied, the world to misunderstand it, and fostered every kind of confusion possible. This week, we're going to talk about anti-art, the Dada movement, and how World War I paved the way for the ready-made. Let's take a deeper look. When madness engulfed much of the world in the Great War in the early 1900s, many artists fled to neutral Switzerland. In the first official Dada group publication, written in 1916, Hugo Ball wrote, quote, our sole purpose is to draw attention across the barriers of war and nationalism to the few independent spirits who live for other ideals, end quote. Suggesting that war is a mainstream ideal was of course a jab in the mainstream's collective ribs. Hans Richter, another founding artist, wrote, quote, our provocations were only a means of arousing the bourgeoisie to rage, and through rage to a shamefaced self-awareness. Dada was a storm that broke over the world of art as the war did over the nations. It was an artistic revolt against art itself, end quote. By the turn of the 19th century, art had become an industry and, therefore, a buttress for the social system that ignited World War I. Dadaists and anti-art artists attempted to free art from the yoke of commercialization and from old rules and values. Each Dadaist was like a young Oedipus, ready to kill his cultural fathers. A quote from Jesse Bryant Wilder, art historian. Their pens and paintbrushes were weapons in the war against tradition. Make no mistake, Dada paintings, poems, and actions are still art, but an art that was meant to provoke change rather than sit on a wall or a pedestal and look pretty. One of the most important features of Dada art was its reliance on chance. Chance became another tool in the Dadaists' anti-art arsenal. They believed that if art truly does reflect life, then not everything in a composition should be composed or so planned. Chance events occur in life, so they should occur in art too. In addition, the Dadaists thought that chance might be an outlet for their unconscious minds. This idea would be further explored by the subsequent art movement, Surrealism. In 1913, artist Marcel Duchamp entered his painting, Nude Descending a Staircase, No. 2, in the groundbreaking Armory Show in New York City. This show was the first major exhibit of modern European art held in the Western Hemisphere. American audiences, bred on realism and patriotic landscape paintings, were shocked and outraged by the work on display. However, over 100,000 people came to see the show, proving that shock and outrage can still be just as big of a draw as talent and skill, even 100 years ago. President Theodore Roosevelt even attended the show, stating afterwards, quote, "That is not art." Duchamp's piece was the most controversial in the show. Inspired by the futurists' goal of illustrating the passage of time in a 2D space, he depicted a nude woman walking down steps. The accordion style is meant to show the stages of her progress, a stylistic choice that emerges in convergence with the growing Cubist movement, showing a subject from multiple angles at once. Notice the visual rhythm created by repeating black lines moving diagonally across the composition. This repetition in one direction creates the sense of movement by literally taking our eyes across the piece. Calling the female figure a nude was meant as a slight against the art establishment. Prior to this, the nude female form was a common subject of art. Embodied in a subject called the male gaze, G-A-Z-E, it was commonly understood that heterosexual men were the creators and the consumers of art. So depicting a nude female was done so with a clear focus on a woman's body as an object. Duchamp took it further in order to point out this absurdity. Painting a collection of lines and movements, in essence a random object, and calling it a nude, provided just as much emotional insight and relevance as a hyper-realistic painting of an idealized but unidentified female body. Before leaving Europe to move to New York in 1916, Duchamp began creating what he called Readymades, an aggressive protest against traditional art. A ready-made is an object from everyday life transformed into art by the will, rather than the craft, of the artist. This is one step further from his nude painting, when calling a series of random shapes a nude is all it took to scandalize the art world. In this ready-made series, Duchamp didn't do anything to the ready-mades other than give them titles, sign and date them. He simply said, "That's art," and put it in a gallery. Quote, "While mocking the stuffy side of the art world, Duchamp's ready-mades also raised interesting questions about the difference between art and non-art. His ready-mades suggest that if you strip a utilitarian function from an object, tack on an artsy title, and stick it in a gallery, then it becomes art. After all, isn't art just about our perception?" End quote. Statement by Jesse Bryant Wilder. Does putting something in a gallery make it art? For example, anyone remember that $100,000 banana that was duct taped to a gallery wall from a few years ago? Technically speaking, that's a ready-made, and it's making the same point Duchamp made in the 1920s. The contemporary art gallery world is guilty of a lot of gatekeeping and pretentious academic speak meant to keep laymen out of the industry. Making the point with a $100,000 banana is the same thing Duchamp was doing with his fountain 100 years ago. This takes me back to our introduction, and even a talking point from my previous video on African American quilting. What is art? Is it something that can only be defined by what it isn't? When long-established rules of law and order go up in gunfire and tank fumes, the world stops making sense. So why follow the same rules that led the world to this point? And why not start making your own?